Hi, I'm Kirsty from We Are Freely, and I'm here to chat about creative monitoring and evaluation. So who am I? How am I even qualified to talk about this? Possibly not. I'm not an academic. I'm not a market researcher. I'm just a black country girl who's the daughter of a bookie and a bin man, and I spent 5 years in community arts where I got my foundation in how to do evaluation a bit more creatively, but have frameworks behind that makes it a bit more robust. And then since then, I've been freelance for 12 years, which means I get to work in collaboration with some awesome creative consultants and powerhouses in evaluation. So I get to get the benefits of all of their skills and experience. And hopefully I'm going to share a bit of my specialism with you today. So what's the difference between evaluation and monitoring? So monitoring, that is the process of checking in on your project as it is happening live, reporting against your deliverables and your targets, in particular to your funders. It's about making sure that you're doing what you said you're going to be doing. Whereas evaluation is the process of understanding your learning, identifying it, and measuring your success. And that's not to say that you can't fail as well. Failure is just as important as your successes, and sharing that, because learning is where you know how to do things differently, better, and is where the interesting stuff is for anybody else who wants to try and do what you're doing. But what do we mean by creative evaluation? And no, I don't mean creatively making up all of the answers and all of the figures just so that you look good. By creative evaluation and monitoring, we just mean asking questions as interestingly as possible. How can you make it more fun? And how can you present information in a way that is engaging? You might wonder what is wrong with a good old survey. And you know what? There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And sometimes you think, we're going to do everything as creatively as possible, but it's a lot more hard work. Don't underestimate the need for a good old survey. It reaches more people easily, it's cheaper, it's less time intensive, but it's not necessarily as accessible. It doesn't mean that everybody can use it, and it isn't going to give you the rich information that really sells the story of what you've been doing. If you want to include lots of visual aids to make your surveys more interesting, it can also mean you have to spend more money on expensive platforms and not just use the free things like SurveyMonkey and Google Sheets. So surveys are great, but they can also be really expensive. Why should you do it creatively then, if a good old survey can do things for you? Well, it can be visually way more interesting, and it can help you reach audiences in a way that gives you richer content. It can make your reports and your evidence so much more exciting for people to engage with and understand what difference you're making with the work that you're doing with communities or audiences. So it is worth it. It just might mean that you have to do all of the things. But methods. There's so many different methods for collecting information from people. You have quantitative methods. So what are all the different quantitative methods? We've already talked about the magic surveys. There's observations, there's polls. The quantitative stuff is all about your numbers. It's the facts and figures. But that's not to say that you can't make qualitative stuff quantitative. But that's a whole different piece of learning that I'm not here to talk to you about. So what's the qualitative things? It's things like your photo documentation. It's your filmmaking. It is people drawing or doodling. It's the Post-it notes with scribbles on. There's so many different ways you can collect qualitative information. But then there's also secondary data. And it's the stuff that you just might collect as part of projects, from box office data to site reports. It'll be the things that happen just organically as part of your process. And all of those things can create a great picture of what you've been doing. So don't forget, you can have a hybrid of all of those things, and actually triangulating data means that you've got more robust information. You might ask a question 3 different ways using 3 different methods, and eventually you might get your answer, depending on who the audience is, because not everybody understands everything. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to evaluation that works every time. And you know what? Evaluation methods can fail too. It's okay, as long as you share and document that learning as part of your process. What are we trying to evidence? In order to understand what methods we might use and how to make them more creative, we need to know what our goals are. What is the difference we're trying to achieve? And therefore, what questions do we even ask? I'm hoping that you might have already thought about how you map all this into a framework. And maybe that's something else you want to learn how to do. But at the very least, it's always good to ask questions and find out information from your audiences and your participants. So the types of things in the cultural sector we're always trying to measure are knowledge, skills, the quality of the experience, which is something Arts Council in particular want you to think about. And even if they're not funding your activity, they might fund future activity. So it's always good to think about where the money's coming from next, and if there's any other questions that they might find useful, even if your current funder doesn't think it's useful. There's also things like social inclusion and well-being, physical health. We can't always measure absolutely everything. So it's always good to focus on the things that you think your activity and your performances are going to achieve. And then there's the unexpected stuff. We just don't know what that might be. So you have to have methods that will enable you to capture other things and highlight them as successes from your project and activity that you didn't know was going to happen. It's always good. So what's in my toolkit? I'm a creative visual person, but you might be performance or drama based. We'll each have our different toolkits of resources. And that's not to say that they can't intermix or that you can't make use of any of those skill sets. I've worked with lots of dancers and storytellers, and they've all enhanced or influenced my practice in some way. But there's some key things I think are really useful, and it's all about how you ask the questions in interesting ways. It's not rocket science. So what's in mine? I have Post-it notes, I have washing line, I have pegs, I have sticky dots. I have things that enable choices and decision making. Postcards that are blank, postcards that have pictures on. There's coins and tokens, luggage tags, all sorts of things. There's things that I might not think I'm going to use, but actually they become an accessible resource for someone to engage with. So you never know what you might need. So it's always good to have quite a few at hand. But creative evaluation methods take preparation. So think about it. Think about the spaces that you're in and how you might use them or how it might impact how you do things. It's all about being prepared. So the first method I'm going to talk to you about as a way to capture information interestingly is your classic Post-it note. Now your Post-it note might not sound particularly creative, but it's really accessible for those that have the ability to write and record their thoughts, to jot things down quickly, and they can make really interesting visual spectacles. You can have walls full of Post-it notes and it makes people want to come up and add their own to it. My colleagues, Morris Hargreaves McIntyre, did this with the David Hockney exhibit, and they had a wall full of them. But remember, Post-it notes are sticky, so if you don't buy proper official ones, they might not be as good as staying on that wall for a long time, which will cause you nightmares when they all flutter down and you're constantly trying to pick them all up. But you can also code Post-it notes. So it's always handy with creative methods to think about how are you going to analyse and record and interpret this information at the end. So giving particular people specific colours, different demographics particular colours, or different stakeholders their own colour can all be a part of how you then process that information. You need to make life easier for yourself. But you can use them with a mixture of other tools, which is the best thing about Post-its. What's even better about Post-its is the Post-it Note app. It is free. I'm not endorsed by Post-it Note whatsoever. However, their app is one of the best things. Whether you just want to use it for planning projects, whether you have a kid who's at school doing their research for homework, it's the best thing. Why? Because you can use your smartphone, whether it is Google, an Android, or Apple, to capture those Post-it notes as individual images. The fact that you can export the Post-it notes not just as your original picture that you took with all of them together, but as individual ones, means that they are really easy to pop in as images in your reports to help show your funders what people said in their own words, in their own handwriting, and that is a powerful thing to use. So it helps you show what you're doing, but helps you analyse what you're doing when you export it into as Excel spreadsheets. It isn't always very successful. I'm trying to determine at the moment whether it identifies different languages or not. But what it can then do is you can export them into Excel spreadsheets, which helps you code all of that qualitative information and make meaning from it and insight from it, which is the most important thing. So do not underestimate the power of a free app to help you. I recommend it highly. Now, a classic sticky dot. Who doesn't love a sticker? Kids love stickers. The best thing about sticky dots is audiences and participants can become easily trained to use them and understand what the ask is of them if you're using them regularly in your sessions. The most important thing with any creative method is that it should be seamless and embedded in what you're doing. So whether it's practice-led from your own skills or something added on, having a 5-minute thing that you can do at the end of every session or at the start of every session is really valuable for capturing information as you go along. Now with sticky dots, you can use them in multiple ways. You can use them with audiences and big, large numbers and have scale questions, or you can have multiple choice questions on big sheets on the wall to help people select different potential options from what you're trying to find out. With all of these things, it's important that you think about your questions. The other thing to remember is who are the people that you're asking, and is this accessible for them? And can you use the walls in the space that you're in to be able to have big sheets of paper on the wall with questions on to put sticky dots? Could be you use it on a table, but sticky dots are your friend. It enables you to get a quick snapshot of information from small groups to large numbers. Now, there are challenges with this, that people become influenced by others' responses and answers. But the more that they get used to it, the more audiences tend to think about what the question is and actually like to be that point of difference. Not in a contrary way, but in a considered way. So whilst you might end up with these big groupings of sticky dots in one place or another, it soon evens itself out. The bias in these types of methods are always things to consider, but equally it can happen with surveys as well. People will think about the things that they want you to know or what they think they should be answering and not what they want to answer necessarily. The great British public in particular is always brilliant at moaning and complaining, but when you want them to say the good and the positives, sometimes they need a little help to understand what their experiences might have been. And that's not about leading them, but it's about getting them to think about it and giving them options to choose from, as well as an option to put whatever they want from their own words to. So what would we use a washing line and some tags for? With all of these things, it's just about finding a different way to ask a question to make it interactive. How can you gamify engaging people in sharing something about themselves? Luggage tags are just really universal. You don't need to use them with a washing line. It can be connected to heritage in a way if you're using a heritage project because it feels authentic to a specific time period. We don't put luggage tags on our suitcases that are paper-based particularly anymore. But they're really easy things to write on. Tie to trees if you're outdoors, or try to a washing line that you've hung on a wall in a room somewhere in, the back end of a community centre. Equally, they're just really nice to use. It's a tactile thing that makes people more willing to share something. But you can also use them as a scale. So you can also add points on your washing line. So it makes the sticky dot scale option even more interactive if you're using something like this. You can also next level up your luggage tag washing line situation. You might want to have questions or answers on sticks to create a crazy map labyrinth in an outdoor space where everybody takes a different coloured string to weave around their responses and then add luggage tags with demographic information on maybe. But the thing to remember, just because it looks amazing and is more creative, you've still got to take it down, decipher it and process that information. So with any creative method, just check in with yourself. How are you going to use it? One of my favourite tools is a zine. And you might not know what a zine is. And it's simply just a DIY magazine. Back in the kind of 70s, people were self-making their own magazines using bits of paper, photocopying, scanning, cutting things out and sticking them down. And it was about reproducing and connecting with like-minded people. So you would often have music zines where they were handed out at gigs to create communities. So a zine is just a DIY magazine and it's often super lo-fi, which means it's really cheap to do. You can collect old magazines and newspapers to make them more fun, or you don't just have to have a blank book that people fill out. So I make them out of one sheet of paper and there's going to be a link for you to download instructions to make one out of one sheet of paper. That's all you need. One sheet of A4, you can use one sheet of A3. It might be that you've designed some pretty ones. I often design pretty ones with prompts on to get people to fill out. And they're great because whilst it is a bit like a survey, it's in a tiny book. So if it's that you've got a whole group of people that are going on a trip, it fits in a lanyard pocket. They can jot things down whilst they're wandering around a space, and it's not as big as a notebook, and it isn't onerous. It also means you can only ask a short number of questions in a really focused way. So it gets you to think about what you really need to know from that experience. I love a zine. They're one of my favourite, most accessible things to use. So they're a great thing for you to try as well, because they're super easy. If you do want to get more creative with zines, as I say, give people time to think. Have lots of magazines they can cut out and give them a theme and a topic that they respond to. Zines are a good way for consultation just as much as it is for evaluation. And the more creative they can be, whether it's filling them with drawings or cutting things out, it enables you to have a rich resource there that tells your story better. Now, not everything has lots of time for a zine to be filled out. And maybe you have performances that are taking places in pubs or cabaret style seating. And you know what? A handy coaster or beer mat is a great way to have a couple of questions on that people can respond to as a quick snapshot. Sometimes getting a small amount of information from a large number of people is better than nothing at all and trying to capture people for surveys. So as I said, you might use lots of these methods all in one go, but a handy beer mat with a few questions can give you lots of useful information. It's just about how you present some questions in interesting ways. How many people, when they're sitting down somewhere, will pick up a coaster, try and flip up a coaster off the edge of a table? Again, it's something tactile, and because it's something different, they're more likely to get a pen out, or if you've already put some on the table, handily fill it out for you. You might think a classic postcard is just like a beer mat, and you're pretty much right, but it's all about how you use them. My colleagues, Maurice Hargreaves McIntyre, used a postcard with an open question prompt for MoMA, and it was one of their most successful exhibitions. Now, having something small that people want to actively interact with means that they had a wall full of drawings and comments. Now, an open question sentence at the top of a postcard is great, and it won't give you the most robust information, but what it does do is it shows that people are inspired to engage further and share something. So even if it's around the quality of experience in that being inspired way, it doesn't have to collect everything or do everything, but it gives you something easy to share and reshare with people long after the project is finished. I've also used postcards to ask very survey-like questions. You can get a lot of information on a postcard, and you might wonder why you would try and cram a survey on a postcard. And in this instance for critical mass, it was about asking some really tricky questions of their participatory dance students around mental health and well-being and loneliness. And they can be really triggering questions, particularly post-pandemic, for anybody. So how do you ask these questions in a way that feels easy and accessible to engage with? And some of this is just about using colour. So for the scales, it can be really hard to know what is the difference between a 10 and a 9. If I'm feeling a 6, how far away is that from an 8 on a scale? But if you have slight differences in colour, it can help people visually understand and engage with your question. And equally, good old emojis. Now, while some of the feelings like anxiety might be tricky to find 5 different emojis for, it just helps give people a context for what that emotion might be like physically, as well as just seeing the word. So if there's as many cues as possible to help people answer your questions, that's really useful. So that's what we did with these postcards, because inclusivity of your method is something that you're going to have to think about. Mapping. There's so many different ways you can map information. And I've done it where we've mapped your days of your week through a planner. Just a simple planner that you might get from your local pound shop that has the days of the week at the top. How can you capture information from people? Because you might want to understand how this fits into their lives. The thing that they're doing with you, how does that fit into the big picture? You can't always know that your project is responsible for someone's improvement in their well-being or their happiness, because Earlier that day, they might have won the lottery, and that might be the thing that you don't know. However, using things like planners can help you get a sense of what their lives are really like. So it's always good with any of your projects to baseline where people are at the start and where people are at the end. You just need to think about what are the things that you need to find out. We use planners to understand what young people's cultural journeys look like. How does culture fit into their days of the week? And you know what? We discovered that they have so busy lives. Like, they've got the homework, they've got school. There's not that much time before they have to go to sleep after they've eaten or done their chores, or you know what, watch their favourite show, played a bit of Xbox to, connect with your friends and learn about who they are. So knowing actually what role your element or your project or your performance fits into the big picture is really useful. You can also use mapping by using actual maps and understand actually what the barriers are for people engaging and how big or how small their lives are. Is everything hyper-locally, in which case they're never going to travel to your project because they only go around 4 different streets, and that one journey that they do is like once a month to visit an auntie somewhere out of obligation. So it's useful to think about these things. We use mapping on the same project to understand actually how far do young people travel to do stuff. It doesn't matter if Birmingham's down the road for them to go and see and do lots of cultural things if they're only ever going to be travelling in Smethwick because their lives are too busy. So how can you bring stuff to people? Other ways to map things are around influence and using a good old-fashioned bullseye to understand how important or how challenging something is for people. There's also fulfillment maps around hopes and fears. And there's also people's relationship to venues and mapping their lives generally. And you don't have to use a geographical map. You could use tokens or icons that help them explore what things mean to them and how important it is. So it's all useful things, it's useful evidence to understanding who the people are that you're working with, who the people are that you're reaching, and why people should be giving you money to continue working with them. So sometimes it's not about your project as it is about the people and what their lives are like currently, and then what their lives are like after you've worked with them. Some of my favourite mapping activities are body mapping ones. And it might be you can't get people to lie on a giant sheet of paper on the floor and draw around them, but you can draw around their hands. And it's just an easy way for people to connect answers to your questions to specific parts of the body. So it might be that you ask a question where everything that they're feeling is located in the chest. Why? Because that's where your heart is. The things that they're thinking about, they pop their answers in the head because that's where they're thinking. The things that they do or have learned are in the hands, and the things that they want to do in the future might be in the feet because that's what takes you places. And the stuff that they didn't like or found challenging that's out of their control is the stuff that's outside of the body. It's the things that when you then come to analyse this information afterwards, you know what questions you asked to be located where, and you don't have to have shared visual written questions with anybody. It's all been captured about where they've located their responses. And it isn't about them writing their responses. It can be around mark making and using colour and line and shape to inform that. But whenever you use images and drawing as your answers, it's always good to have that context. You always need to know what does it mean, because a sharp, angry, angular line to you might mean something different to somebody else. And the colours might have different intonations for them. So you have to understand the context by some people's answers. Expressive mark making doesn't just have to be with mapping. It can be on its own. And the power of some pastels on a black piece of paper can feel daunting to some people, but it's also a creative catalyst for conversations. It's a way for you to explore feelings that might be tricky for some groups by exploring how they make shapes on paper, what colours they use or associate. So actually, it's just about having a conversation and distracting them from the big themes by having something to do with their hands. So it's something that's worth trying, but it can take a long time for you to understand what everything means and what you do with it, because that's a lot of paper with marks on that you need to understand at the end of the day. Journaling doesn't work for everybody, but it can be really successful. So it could be that you're working with a group over a long period of time and you want them to capture their experiences or thoughts from projects that they've seen, activities, what's going on in their lives. They might not want to be that creative, but it's about finding the right method for the right people. And journaling can give you lots of rich information. However, it can't just happen in isolation. They need to have prompts. So it might be that you have to call participants up every now and again and check in with them and give them something to respond to, or post some things that they then add into their scrapbooks. But journaling can be a good way to capture people's experiences. It doesn't have to be in a physical book though, but we'll come back to that. Making associations is a really handy way to get conversations flowing, whether it's consultation, feedback, or just to help people get outside of themselves. Picture sorting and word sorting is really helpful, and you can buy postcards or collect free postcards. It doesn't have to connect directly to the things that you're doing. It's about people drawing something from them, whether it's of animals and nature, abstract art. It's always useful to collect and store any postcards that you come across, whether they're freebies in magazines, from the things that you've ordered, or you used to get them in cinemas, but you probably don't anymore. However, they're handy things to have, because then you can ask a question of, what pictures would you use to describe this experience or this place, or reminds you of this? And it creates conversations between different people as well, as they share why they've chosen something. So it can help those that don't often come forward with answers or their opinions to be a part of a conversation. Now, if you're a performer, you might be like, this is great having all of these visual things, but I don't have a tool bag of things like this that I take around with me. I have my phone, I have my music, and I have a few other bits and games that are in my head that we do. So it's important to think about the physical space. How can you ask a question and denote areas in a room for people to respond to? Those that are really active quite like running around to give a different answer as you ask a different question, or wheeling around if they're in a chair. So think about how people can participate in your approach. Maybe it's, if you're at one end of a line, the answer is this, if you're at the end of another line. But remember, you have to document it with photography or film so that you know who is standing where, or what percentage of the group is standing where, depending on how you're cross-tabulating your information at the end. Remember, you don't have to always know what answer came from which person all of the time, because if you're not going to cross-reference with their age or their gender or their beliefs, you don't need to know it all together in one go. The other thing to think about with physical space is actually everybody can see what everybody answers. So you might want to do activities where people have their eyes closed and they hold up fingers for their responses, or they have different objects they hold up to show their response to a question. If it's a closed question like yes or no, or I have. Some of these techniques are used to explore really difficult topics from a psychological point of view in schools. So what type of experiences you've had might mean that you move forward a step or you move backward a step. And then you look around after all of the questions have been asked to see where everybody in the room is positioned. It helps people get an awareness of other people's experiences, what their lives are like, what their level of privilege is like, or actually understand that they're not alone in, say, being bullied because more members of their class have been bullied than they would think, or have been experiencing physical harm. It can be a useful way to explore difficult topics to answer in a physical space. The other thing to think about is the room itself. Do you have tables? Can you put on a paper tablecloth, ask a question on the tablecloth, and leave people to leave their answers anonymously as part of their day or experience? You can't always guarantee asking questions at the end of something. Or maybe it's a festival week and everybody's really busy running around, but you know what? You can capture people when they're eating their lunch or taking a break. So use the physical space and the moments where you know people will be breaking out and chatting with each other to try and capture some of that stuff. Self-directed. It's not about you leading it, it's just about you leaving a prompt for them to engage with. And tablecloth doodles are always super fun and easy to capture at the end. You've got your question there and you know what the answers are. I've already talked about mark making as a creative catalyst. Now, I've used it with theatre performers who don't like mark making. It was out of their comfort zone because they're not visual. And challenging people can be really good. So it's important to think that whilst this might not be a method you would associate with this group of people or this age of people, it's always interesting to take people out of their comfort zones. In this image, you can see young people with rogue bags on their head. And I promise you, this wasn't me just doing something weird. It was to connect with their performance that they had created. So making sure it was practice-led and influenced by something that reminded them of what they were going to be talking about. They were having a post-show discussion and they used lots of paint as part of their performance. They had sacks on their head as part of the imagery and the things that they wanted to convey. And so we wanted to put the performers in that position whilst the audience then reflected on their experience. So it can just be about putting people back into a sense of place or time and using things like music as a cue for a creative catalyst. It could be music from a time period, from an experience, or having that sensory element of smells to connect with something that you want people to explore. Those sensory elements and tactile elements can be important to capture those feelings that you want to record. Other things are just little challenges. So in this instance, I used a 6-word story for people to capture their experience. Now, Hemingway was challenged to write a story in 6 words. And I'm never going to remember this quite right, but it was something like baby shoes for sale, never worn. 6 words. But the space and gaps it left in that meant that you could tell your own stories about what you thought that might mean. 6-word stories just means it can get to the nitty and gritty of what people really think. You don't need and this, and then that. Sometimes you just need amazing, tiring, beautiful, people loving everyone. It says a lot. I couldn't tell you what that meant, I just made it up. But 6-word stories can be something really simple that challenge people to really get to the heart of what they think. Documenting what you're doing seems like a no-brainer. And having people who are good photographers capture what you're doing is really important. If you can afford filmmakers, amazing. Vox Pops, you might want to embed that into a final film that visually shows what you've been doing, but you can also do that kind of thing on your phone. So that kind of visual documentation where you have a snapshot of questions that you can ask people at the end of activity, in the middle of activity, or encouraging your participants to ask each other really quickly is a great thing to do. But you can also document your projects and activity and shows in other ways. You could get illustrators involved to capture the movements, or artists who might use different colours to represent the things that they're seeing. For Critical Mass, the audience agency commissioned several different types of illustrators to respond to what the different groups were doing, whether they were a Zoom group meeting up to develop dance or an in-person group. But it means that actually it helps to anonymize some of those people, and it gives you a rich thing that you can then use in your reports or to share statistics with people afterwards in a really visually appealing way. So don't just limit your documentation of your project to filmmaker and photography. However, they are vitally important. Why? Because it really brings to life all of the information you're collecting so that people can instantly see the thing that you did and how it made a difference. Now, social platforms, they are something that can be a rich source of information, but you can't just broadcast. You have to engage people in conversation. And ethnography in this way, where you're observing the interactions of people, the comments of people, can be really challenging, but really rewarding. So think about those tools at your disposal. It might not be relevant to what you're doing, but they can give you quick snapshots of those that are engaged on your website or your social platforms, because you have that insight data there around who those people are. So why not ask them a question? If they've been to your shows, performances or workshops, invite them to actively share their own images back with you. And it means that they then have a sense of belonging of your organisation and can share a sense of pride in the things that they've achieved with you. So eliciting information in that way is great. You can then look at the sentiment of what those comments are. Are they mainly positive or negative? What is the most common words? It's a great way to create easy graphics like a Wordle. Not everyone loves a Wordle, but it gives you something that you can create visually at the end for easy sharing. Other things to do on digital platforms are using digital whiteboards. The pandemic has shown us that we had to switch activity online, but how do we capture things online? A digital whiteboard is a great way to do that. It's using some of the creative methods I've already told you and shared with you, but putting it in a digital space. So you're still using Post-it notes, you're just using it digitally. And there's a few different tools that you can use, from a Google Jamboard to a Miro board to Mural, but it's understanding whether your participants have that kind of digital accessibility or confidence to access these spaces. So again, always remember, is this the right method for your group? But you can also do fun things like digital polls, and they can be live interactive polls. Mentimeter is a great tool for asking questions in interesting ways and capturing snapshots. So it's kind of like a survey, but they can also see and share the live responses that their entire group is giving you. And it's always fun to ask some road questions. So if it's happening at Christmas time, maybe you say, sprouts or parsnips? Is Santa Claus real? Adding fun questions in makes it easy for people to answer the harder questions as well and share their ideas. Other digital platforms, much like the journaling one, are things like Padlet, which enables you to do digital scrapbooking. You can leave questions as prompts. You can use it as a space where everyone shares ideas. It doesn't just have to be an evaluation tool. As many of these things can be used as part of your creative process as possible. It's not just about collecting information, but how you can co-create together, how can you lead the journey and experience of making and collaborating as interactive and as led by the people who you're working with as possible. Digital scrapbooks are great because you can also create timelines, you can share videos, images, other resources. Padlet gives you 10 free boards, and then after that you need a paid for account. But maybe that's all you need. Some of these things have their limits. An important thing to consider in whatever you're doing is your own reflective practice. Everybody needs to take time to digest what has happened and how it can influence what they do next. You might want to just create voice notes for yourself. You might want to have debriefs at the end of everything, whether it's a post-show discussion or a debrief with teachers at the end of a workshop. Consider who are the people that are involved in that reflective practice. So some of it could be about your own personal practice, and others are about that group discussion, so that you get objective insights and can challenge each other about what you really think happened. It helps you apply your learning live as you're delivering and not just at the very end. Back in 1988, Gibbs said, "It is not sufficient to have an experience in order to learn. Without reflecting on this experience, it may be quickly forgotten or its learning potential lost." So you need to think about the description. What is it you did? The feelings. How did you feel about it? What did you think about it? So you need to evaluate. What was the good things? What was the bad things? What were the successes? And then it's the analysis and insight from that. So what sense can you make of the experience overall? And conclude it. What could you have done differently? Or was there anything you could have done differently? And then action plan. So what changes next? How does it influence what those next steps are? And this reflective practice approach is really good when you're co-creating with other people, whether it's collaborating with creative partners or directly with your participants, communities, and audiences. Having actionable insight to inform your programming and your next projects is really important. There's so many methods I haven't covered. I haven't covered observations, which aren't necessarily that creative, but they're not your typical survey. You need to think about what is the information you're trying to find out and who's best placed to give you that evidence. Is it the teacher that's in the room, or the early years practitioner, or the parent, or a carer, or a friend? Think about how others can share useful information and make observations. And what is the format they do that in? Are they already collecting it for another purpose? Or is there a step that you need to add in with the right questions? The key thing is not to make anything overburdensome and just embed it into how you're working and how your stakeholders are working. There's also things like feedback walls. We've talked about post-it notes, but actually maybe there's a space where everyone can write directly onto something. Is it a piece of glass, a door, a mirror, and a Posca pen? Something that's really powerful can be just the act of that slight, illegal graffiti edge to it by vandalizing something with words. And of course, there's always the challenges that there might be, rude words or images depicted in those spaces. So they'll need a bit of moderation. But having that trust and freedom is actually quite a powerful thing to empower people with and make them feel confident that this is a space that is safe and welcoming to them. There's also things like timeline mapping and photo elicitation. So when I showed you my sticky dot picture earlier, there was photos there. Using photos from past activities or even the activities of that day that you've quickly printed out on an instant printer can be really helpful to those that might have short memories or learning difficulties, so that they can be reminded about the specific things that you're asking. Don't always assume that everyone's going to remember what happened last week. I definitely wouldn't be able to tell you what I did last week. So why would you expect anyone else? So always think about what your experience would be and what their experience would be. Put yourself in their position and remind yourself that if you wouldn't do that, why would you expect anybody else to do it? There's also things like using tokens. Basic demographic information can be challenging to capture, but if you can ask questions where people are putting tokens in pots, it can make things really quick and simple, and they're more willing to give you that information they find a bit sensitive, or will always question, why are you asking that? And then there's focus groups and forums. These types of things are spaces for conversation, and you might use the tools that I've already shared, but within these contexts, always think about how many people you're inviting, because you want conversation to flow, and you need to think about your questions. It's got to be a facilitated experience in those and not self-directed. So consider the time that you need to put in for discussion guides to make sure that you're covering all eventualities and you're enabling everyone to have a voice, because those with the loudest voices in the room can sometimes drive where conversation goes or drown out other people. So whilst there's lots of things I haven't covered, and even those extra things that I've just mentioned still doesn't scratch the surface, because hopefully you're going to create your own practice-led methods. Hopefully it just means that people can feel more confident and able to share with you their opinions, feel valued, and enable you to show the difference that you've made to them and their lives. We've talked about lots of different creative collection methods for your evaluations, but what about that monitoring part? Remember, I simply said it's about how you present the information sometimes. Now, data dashboards are something my colleagues at MB Associates use. They were inspired by how I present my reports really visually and use infographics. They've taken it a step further and they create data dashboards where they're presenting infographics as part of their monitoring process. It's taking all the stuff that you're already collecting and just sharing it more regularly, whether it is that tweet that someone said about that performance, or whether it is a piece of feedback direct from a Vox Pop, combined with your statistics over who your audiences were or where they came from. So sometimes it's just about how you present it. That visually appealing snapshot just helps people get what you're doing faster and easier, and enables them to endorse and understand what you're doing without reading lots of pages of information. So think about how you can embed that as part of that monitoring process. It's not just about filling out the standard quarterly report that you have to send back. It's about giving them that something extra that means that it will stay in their mind. But it's also a resource that you can use to be transparent with your audiences, your communities, and more easily say, this is why we need your help to give us more feedback, because it proves that we're doing something good. Now, I've shared lots of different methods with you, but how do you know which method to use? You need to consider who the audience is. Are they able to answer your questions with the methods that you have chosen? Are they willing to answer? And whether that's because of the type of questions that you're asking or how you're asking them. And then lastly, are they enabled to answer? So thinking about their learning style. Does it appeal to them because they can see what's being asked of them, they can hear it, or they can read it? And sometimes you need to be able to do all three of those things, which is why it's about multi-methods. It's not just about a one-size-fits-all. So consider the language that you're using. You don't want to use words that's too jargony, and that can be challenging when you have to use specific survey tools as part of your funding agreements. So sometimes it might be about how you can ask those questions in a different way and then translate it back through those survey tools, particularly when it comes to things like quality. You need to consider literacy standards. So actually a creative tool might be the answer to not having lots of written things. Knowledge. Are you assuming the knowledge of the person around the things that you're doing? If you can have as many open questions as possible that enables them to elicit authentic responses, that's really powerful. Are people willing to? When you're using things like Vox Pops, or you're asking people to maybe create digital diaries, they can see themselves being filmed and it can make them really self-conscious. So self-confidence is a big thing for some of those methods. So whilst it might seem like a brilliant creative resource or approach that you can then use and will give you this rich information, doesn't necessarily mean it's right for the group that you think it is. And think about the cultural norms. It might not be a process they engage in. It might be, such as a Thai group that I worked with, they saw everything as homework. So we couldn't just ask their opinion so easily or use lots of creative methods. We had to set it as a piece of work that they had to do in order to find out what their experience was like. So understanding the culture of the individuals you're working with can really shape what methods you use. Are they enabled to? So learning styles, we've covered that. But actually, was it fun? Was there a welcome invitation to get involved and to feel like their opinions were valued and they were mattered, and that you will do something with them? And be transparent about what you're going to do with that and why you're asking them. It's really important. And most importantly, sometimes it's the enjoyment of it. Even if it's been really challenging, if they feel like they're able to and willing to share their experiences with you because it's such an accessible and fun way, can make that final difference to them coming back in the building the next week. There's lots of tools and resources out there. So I've got links and a download for you that helps you check out different resources that help you with the wider evaluation planning, in case that's something that you still need to explore. But there's also helpful things like the tools that I've mentioned, both the online ones and the survey ones, just so that you can not feel so alone in exploring different creative methods. But don't forget, evaluation is about sharing the story of what you've been doing and the difference it's made. Evaluation is more than numbers. It's about providing actionable research. It's about gathering insight and evidence for your own strategic planning, whether it's just for the next project or for your whole organisation. It needs to inform the aspects of your operation, but also be relevant to your audiences and your participants and the multiple stakeholders that are invested in you and the work that you're doing. You want to assure that what you're doing is of quality, particularly for funders. And so you need to capture robust data that is both quantitative and qualitative. The creative stuff really helps you with the qualitative. So please do explore it and see how you can embed more of it in the things that you're doing, and not just at the end in a hasty, oh my God, I forgot about evaluation. How can I make this work? You need to ensure that there can be objective interpretation around those insights and that analysis. And sometimes it's about how you present your insights back to the groups that you've been working with. Get them to check it. Get them to see whether it's right. The conclusions you drew from what happened, does it make sense to them? Involving them back in that cycle of reviewing is really important. But something to consider is, what are the core questions that you need to ask for all of your projects, for your organisation? And how can you start doing that all the time and embed those key questions in all the time for longitudinal research? Finally, if there's any questions, there is a live Q&A webinar where you can interrogate the things that I've shared and ask for more detail. But I also run other courses. So you can always get in touch to find out more around evaluation and how you can make it more robust or develop more frameworks around it. So I'm Kirsty. It's been lovely chatting to you and sharing some of my skills and knowledge with you, and hopefully you find them useful.